We're going to begin by looking at the topic of undue influence, a dynamic by which one person causes another person to act in a way clearly against that other person's best interest. I have coming across my desk the case of an 82-year-old gentleman who, a short while ago, changed his will. He eliminated his children and his grandchildren in favor of his new, attractive 23-year-old housekeeper, fortuitously named Bonnie High Price. As soon as the kids got wind of this, of course, they hired an attorney who in turn hired me to examine the man and determine his mental competence. And he was perfectly competent. He clearly knew what a will was. He knew that he had changed it. He had a pretty good idea of what he was worth, about $2 million. He knew ordinarily who would be the natural heirs of his bounty, his children and his grandchildren. And he passed all the other measures of competence. He knew who the president was, the governor. He knew we had combat troops in 2 Middle Eastern countries. He knew who won the World Series. He could do computations in his head and so on and so forth. So by any clinical criteria, he was competent. So his attorney then turned to the treating doctor. And the treating doctor said, "Oh, gosh, Sam, treated him for 30 years. He's as sharp as a tack." Now, of course, this treating doctor was an orthopedist who was focusing primarily on this gentleman's arthritis. And orthopedists are notoriously insensitive to anything that might be going on above the neck. So he was of very little value, except, of course, the attorney on deposition could get him to acknowledge that he never really pried into this man's mental thinking and simply took his social surface at face value. The attorney who drew up the new will was, of course, of no value here. What attorney is going to acknowledge that he was instrumental in getting an incompetent individual to sign a contract or change his will? So you can see the problems attendant to overturning what on its face was clearly a specious will that probably was at war with anything this man would have done absent Bonnie's nefarious influence. The law is very reluctant to overturn documents which on their face appear valid. If a man is absolutely drunk when he marries, the law is clear he remains married, especially if he, in the words of the statute, continues to enjoy his wife's favors while sober. I think this tracks back to an old common law notion that if a man purchases a worn-out mare while drunk, he's stuck with the horse if he continues to ride her while sober. So the burden clearly would be here on the children to prove that there was some negligence or some malevolent forces at work here that caused their dad to change his will. Well, since he was competent, that leaves us with one other possibility, which is undue influence, which the law defines as the application of force by one person upon another, thereby getting that other person to act or think in a way that is at war with their best interest, and much more in accord with the person who's exerting that influence. Let me quickly distinguish that from benign garden variety influence. My mother loves to play the stock market. She did so with some success until her 90s. But I remember years ago coming to her and telling her, Mom, at your age, I'm not so sure you should be investing in these fly-by-night Silicon Valley tech stocks like Google and Apple. Yeah, you should be putting your money into good, solid blue chip stocks like General Motors Preferred. That was a good idea, wasn't it? Fortunately, my mother ignored my advice, which she often did, because my mother's personality was easily as forceful as mine. My effort to persuade her was transparent. There was nothing by way of a hidden agenda. It was my concern for her and so on. So here we have an effort to influence, but it would hardly be characterized as undue. The attorney, therefore, has the task of distinguishing that kind of influence from this more malevolent, undue form. And there are 5 elements that are readily established. And if you establish those, you can knock out a will, you can knock out a contract, you can knock out a trust, and so on. The first is that the person who's exerting the undue influence, we'll call that person, let's call that person the beneficiary to be, on to the person who's being influenced. We can call that person, in the case of this will contest, the testator. That person has a hidden agenda. That person has an agenda which was in conflict with the best interest of the person who's being influenced, the testator. Clearly, Bonnie's aspiration to a summarily higher standard of living, her expectation of such, would meet that agenda definition. Secondly, the influence being exerted is invisible to the person who is being acted upon. I think it is a natural tendency to resist persuasion when you know it's there. There's that initial instinct that someone's trying to get me to do something. But if that persuasion is invisible, that defense is absent. Had Mark Antony gone down to the Roman Senate and boldly stated what he was there for, which was to illustrate or exemplify the assassins, Brutus and his company, that had assassinated his mentor, Julius Caesar. And he was very upfront and said, I'm here to castigate these individuals. The Roman Senate, which had long been wary of Julius Caesar, would have shown him the door, or worse. But Mark Antony didn't do that. He came down and he said, I'm not here to praise Caesar, but to bury him. And then he proceeded to say some complimentary things about the Brutus, which on its first hearing seemed rather nice. And so the Senate, thus disarmed, was much more susceptible when Mark Antony gradually got to what he was really there for, which was to demonstrate Brutus and the other conspirators as the jackals that they really were. So it is important that the person who is exerting that influence do it in such a way that it is not apparent to the person who is the object of that influence. Thirdly, you are able to demonstrate, often in these cases, that the testator has become isolated from his previous contacts with the world. He may be bedridden, he may be largely confined to the house, he just doesn't get around very much. And fourthly, the beneficiary to be is his principal conduit to the rest of the world. She does the shopping, all the errands, she does the cooking, she opens the mail, she screens the calls, she pays the bills, she takes him to the doctor, she takes him to his new attorney, which brings us to the next element, which is that the testator is increasingly dependent upon the beneficiary to be for his contact with the rest of the world. The kids show up on Thanksgiving and on Christmas and on birthdays, but they've got a full life. They just don't get to see Dad that much, and the housekeeper is there 24/7. So increasingly he becomes dependent upon that person. So that, coupled with that isolation, you can see, gives the beneficiary to be tremendous leverage over the testator. And the fifth element the attorney must establish is that there is an inequality of power between the two. That the beneficiary to be, either because of youthful vigor or charisma or some other personality trait, gradually overwhelms the personality and the will of the person being acted upon, who may be at a disadvantage because of old age, dementia, physical debility, medication effects, possibly the overuse of recreational substances. So you see, even though the burden is clearly by law on the person who's attempting to overturn what seems on its face to be a perfectly legitimate document, by establishing these 5 elements of undue influence, it can be done.